Okay, I'm going to begin. If people are still finding their way, they'll have to find it. We're very thrilled tonight to have a really important figure come all the way out here to Scranton to speak to us. We always try to bring out important speakers, and from what's going on in the news, you all know the Middle East, all the discussions. Who better to bring out than someone who's really an expert on it? Those who watch the cable news shows and read the papers, read the magazines, the Wall Street Journal, Tablet, the gamut. You probably know the name Bret Stephens. Just Google his name and you'll see how important he is in the area of public opinion, despite his young age. He's really made an incredible mark. At the age of 28, senior editor of the Jerusalem Post, the newspaper, before that working for the Wall Street Journal, and now one of the editors on the editorial page. You didn't come to hear me, you came to hear him, so I will call him up. But first, let me just tell you how it's going to work. He's only going to speak for about a half hour, 35 minutes, to leave plenty of time for questions. I mean, the gambit of the Middle East, not only what he speaks about, but in particular what he speaks about, really whatever is on your mind. This is a really good opportunity to hear from someone who has the pulse of the Middle East and of Washington, D.C. So without any further ado, I want to call on Bret Stephens.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for inviting me out here this afternoon. And it's a kind of rainy, gray, drizzly day. Thanks for making the effort to come and hear me talk. I belong to what you might call the foreign policy community of the United States. And when you belong to this semi-illustrious group, underscoring the word semi, your goal in life is basically to be the next Henry Kissinger. And if you want to be the next Henry Kissinger, you have to come up with a foreign policy doctrine that is in that great Germanic intellectual tradition. You know, you think of some of the great foreign policy concepts in Western history. There's the Prince Metternich's Concert of Nations. There is George Kennan's Containment. There is Kissinger's own Détente. So, not so surprisingly, I spend a great deal of my time pondering what my bequest to this school of thinking could be. What is my school of thought? And the last 16, 17 months since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring have given me an opportunity to refine my thinking and even come up with a doctrine. So what I'd like to take this opportunity to do at the University of Scranton is announce my foreign policy worldview as the Larry David Doctrine. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you look around the world and you look at what's happening, my first piece of counsel, my first piece of advice is curb your enthusiasm. Now, back in January of 2011, there was immense enthusiasm on the pages of certain major metropolitan American newspapers that happen not to be the Wall Street Journal. I won't mention any names. About the revolution that then appeared to be transpiring in Egypt. And you had various heavyweight columnists going out to Tahrir Square and saying that this was the beginning of something new and something wonderful. That the people in the square were not the Muslim Brothers, they were not the Salafists, they were young people who were eager to take hold of their own destiny and to chart a more progressive, a more liberal, a more prosperous course for themselves, their generation, and presumably their children. And that was more or less the line, and that's what gave us the terms Arab Spring or Arab Awakening. And then you saw this revolutionary or apparently revolutionary process unfold, what had already started in Tunisia. Then it spread to Libya. It spread to Yemen. It's still bubbling in Bahrain, where I was just a few weeks ago. Of course, it's very much remains very much in the news in Syria. And the general Western attitude was a positive one. President Obama, in fact, literally adopted his predecessor's freedom agenda as his own in a speech in May of last year, saying that it is the policy of the United States to support these supposedly freedom-loving, pro-democratic movements. Now, at the time, I took a very skeptical view of what was happening, and I wrote, as I said, as much in a succession of columns. And I did so for, I guess, three main reasons. The first reason is that the history of revolutions outside of the United States tends not to be such a good one. That is to say, our own American revolutionary tradition, we think, well, you know, the Brits were taxing us too much, we didn't like it, we had these terrific characters named Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton and so on. We had a revolution, we won, we set up a constitution which, for all of its flaws, endures to this day and has created this empire of liberty. But if you look at revolutionary traditions elsewhere, it doesn't tend to work out quite as well. French Revolution, like the American Revolution, begins in 1789, not just at the Bastille, but with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the meeting of the three states, the decision to create a kind of constitutional monarchy. Louis XVI returns to Paris. I mean, I presume you know this history. And then within, I don't know, 2 years, 3 years, the heads are rolling in what was once known as the Place de la Concorde, which becomes the Place de la Révolution. And the guy in charge is a fellow named Maximilien Robespierre. And that's followed by the Thermidorian reaction, and that's followed by the Napoleonic period and endless war and misery for the entire European continent. 1917, there's another revolution, well known, and this is how it was greeted by an American president. He said, "Does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Russia was known by those who knew it best to have been always, in fact, democratic at heart, in all the vital habits of her thought, in all the intimate relationships of her people that spoke their natural instinct, their habitual attitude towards life. The autocracy that crowned the summit of her political structure," this president said, "long as it had stood and terrible as was the reality of its power, was not, in fact, Russian in origin, character, or purpose, and now it has been shaken off, and the great, generous Russian people have been added in all their naive majesty and might to the forces that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice, and for peace. Here is a fit partner for a League of Honor." Those words were spoken by Woodrow Wilson in his April 1917 war message to Congress. And of course, what he was talking about was Alexander Kerensky's social democratic revolution in March of 1917, which overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. And for a period of about six months or so, you could plausibly make the argument that something good and positive had happened in Russia, until a fellow by the name of Vladimir Lenin, with colleagues like Joseph Stalin, seized power in the Bolshevik coup and set up a tyranny that then endured for 73 or 74 years. So the Russian example is also a reminder that revolutions which begin with these hopes for some better stage in a country's national development don't always wind up like the American Revolution. In fact, more often than not, they wind up like the Russian Revolution. So that was one factor that made me suspicious, or at least cautious, about embracing what was happening in places like Tahrir Square as something that was going to lead to a better future for Egypt. The second factor is some awareness, I think, of the history of the Arab world. How many of you in this room have seen Lawrence of Arabia? Peter O'Toole, great film. Omar Sharif, it's a great, you can Netflix it or whatever. It's worth watching again. Well, what was the Arab world revolting against in 1915, 1916? They were revolting against the tyranny that was known as the Ottoman Empire. 5, 10, 15 years later, the Arabs are revolting again against another, not exactly a tyranny, but a colonial occupation, primarily British, but also to some extent French. And you have revolts in Iraq that the British bloodily suppress, and in Palestine during the 1930s that the Brits suppress, again in Egypt, and so on. Then a few years after that, you have a series of revolts that rock the Arab world, not all of them successful, but they all happen around the same time against the monarchies. There is in Egypt this very overweight, pampered king named King Farouk. He's overthrown by the Free Officers Movement of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who, it's worth remembering at the time, was considered a great liberator of his country. There is a king in Iraq, King Faisal, who is also considered a tyrant. He's overthrown by a movement known as the Ba'ath Party. Ba'ath Party eventually gives us Saddam Hussein. There is in Libya, a few years later, an old, relatively benign king by the name of Idris. And Idris is overthrown one fine afternoon by a guy who all of you know about well. His name is Muammar Gaddafi. So then there's this series of revolts against the monarchies. And then today, what we are witnessing is what you might call the revolt against the autocracies. Now, what you notice is a pattern that every 20 or 30 years, revolutions or revolts sweep the Arab world. They sweep out bad rulers, and they install bad rulers. So it's worth, again, applying the Larry David rule. Curb your enthusiasm. Don't be so sure that just because what has left the scene is bad, what will replace it is going to be better. Now, the third reason, final reason I was skeptical about what was happening in Egypt, elsewhere, is that I have some experience as a journalist getting to know political Islamist movements. I have interviewed leaders of Hezbollah in Beirut. I have interviewed leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I have interviewed leaders of Hamas in Gaza. I've met a lot of these men, and they're always, by the way, they're always men, a not so insignificant fact. And what I knew about political Islamism is that it is very organized, very patient, very systematic, very cunning, very ruthless, and very dangerous. And today we're telling ourselves, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but today we're telling ourselves a story that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood are moderate, reasonable, negotiable, pliant, and so on. And I would warn people, again, to curb their enthusiasm when it comes to imagining that the United States, Israel, or people in those countries who want to live under some other kind of freer dispensation are going to have an easier time of it when the Brotherhood takes the reins of power in any of these countries. So what has happened, I mean, if we look at, sort of imagine a picture of the greater Middle East in our minds, what has happened since January of 2011, since the movement in Tahrir Square? Well, in Tunisia, a country that, according to most Western observers, was the most secular, the most woman-friendly, the most advanced of the Arab countries, all of those points totally wrong, but that's another story. The first party to win a plurality in the parliament was the Tunisian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Egypt, where the prediction was, and you heard this from guys like other columnists at other papers, won't say, you can imagine who I mean, where the view was because the secular liberals had led the march in Tahrir, they owned the revolution. What happened? Well, within a matter of months, it was the Brotherhood that had taken possession of the revolution. And when parliamentary elections were held, what happened was the Brotherhood took just over 50% of the vote. The second largest party is the even more extreme, more radical, more Islamist, Salafist Noor party, leaving a handful of so-called liberal parties to pick up the crumbs of what's left of those parliamentary seats. In the Palestinian Authority, Hamas has been entrenched and is all the more entrenched in the Gaza Strip since it won an election freely and fairly, fair and square, in 2006. And you can rest certain that if the Palestinian Authority ever dared to have an election throughout the region, throughout the West Bank, that Hamas, if the election were fair, would win again. Lebanon has been under the control of Hezbollah since 2010. Turkey, which used to be the closest Muslim nation ally of the United States, has, under its Islamist leader, Prime Minister Erdogan, essentially moved into the column of Israel's adversaries, opponents, and ideologically enemies. And finally, there is Iran and the massive challenge that that country today presents not only Israel, but presents all of the West. You know, I've been going around giving speeches for a long time saying, Iran, 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 and people say, it's never going to happen, they're never going to go for a bomb, they don't want a bomb, and so on. In November of last year, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is not represented by crazy neocon, Ahmed Chalabi, mendacious types, it's a very sober organization, presented its most comprehensive report on Iran's nuclear programs. And it should have left very little doubt that the Iranians are making swift work towards a nuclear weapons capability. Now, I want to be clear, since this is going to be on YouTube, what I mean by capability. A nuclear weapon is like a dish. You need so much enriched uranium, you need the weaponization side of the weapon, what makes it go boom, and then you need a means of delivering it. Now, the Iranians have been moving along those three separate lines. They have been producing growing stockpiles of enriched uranium. And this is a bit of a simplistic metaphor, but I ran it by a man who used to build atomic bombs at Los Alamos, and he basically, will concur with this. But enriching uranium is like putting food in a blender. If you want to blend it to 3%, kind of mushy, you can do that. If you keep your finger on the button for a little longer, you get it smoother. And if you want the pure smoothie, you just keep doing it a little longer. It's technically not very difficult to get from civilian-grade uranium to highly enriched uranium. You just have to keep enriching the same material over and over again. The Iranians have moved to acquire a large stockpile of civilian-grade enriched uranium. They're producing medium-grade enriched uranium. They're putting themselves in a position to have as much uranium as they need to rapidly ramp up their production capabilities to have sufficient stockpiles of high-enriched uranium. Then there's the weaponization angle, and people say, well, this is a hugely complicated thing. Again, I put this to this gentleman. His name is Tom Reed. He used to be Secretary of the Air Force in the Ford administration and built bombs at Lawrence Livermore, not at Los Alamos. Tom Reed says, well, it depends on what kind of bomb you want to build. If you want a bomb of the sort that now fit on modern US nuclear missiles, well, that's a highly complicated thing. Anyway, those are all hydrogen bombs anyway. But if you want to build a bomb like the one that destroyed Hiroshima, said essentially any idiot can build that. All you need are sufficient quantities of highly enriched uranium. You need about, as he put it, about 140 pounds. You need to fire a bullet of uranium and hit what effectively amounts to a core of uranium, and it blows up. This is not a very sophisticated bomb, but it's nonetheless a bomb that was sufficient to level an entire city in August of 1945. And then finally, there's the question about their means of delivery. And every 2 or 3 months, we are treated to videos and sites of the Iranians firing ballistic missiles with ever-increasing ranges. So when I talk about a nuclear weapons capability, I'm not saying I can't divine Iran's intention in putting these three aspects of their dish together. What I'm saying is that if you have them stacked here, you have that capability, and no nation is going to be able to effectively stop you from acquiring it. So that's where we stand with the Iranian nuclear question. And we will have to face a choice, never mind in Israel, here in the United States, whether we're prepared to live with a nuclear Iran. I'm going to get to that discussion in a moment. Now let me come back, since this is the subject of my address, to where all this leaves Israel. In my view, this leaves Israel in the most precarious strategic position it has been in, perhaps in its entire history. Why? Its deadliest enemy is on the cusp of developing a nuclear weapon. The peace treaties that had helped guarantee its security over the past 30 years are crumbling. Above all, it's the peace treaty with its largest Arab neighbor, Egypt. It finds itself in a situation, an increasingly precarious situation in terms of global opinion. In terms of efforts, I don't know about the University of Scranton, but certainly on college campuses across the United States, across Canada, to treat Israel as essentially a modern-day apartheid South Africa. And above that, it faces the ordinary stresses that have affected, that affect any democracy that has strengths, weaknesses, problems, social issues, the ordinary facts of democratic life. So what is it, if you are an Israeli decision maker, or an Israeli policymaker, what sort of course you should take? Well, last year, and even now, maybe more especially with the publication of this book called The Crisis of Zionism, this year, there is a view that what Israel needs to do is, in the cliche, carpe diem. It needs to seize the day. It needs to say, this is a great opportunity, these revolts in the Arab world, to make a dramatic gesture showing that Israel is prepared, committed to live in peace with its Palestinian neighbors and to usher into existence a Palestinian state. Now, my own view is informed by a wonderful scene in that movie. Unfortunately, it's with Russell Crowe, but otherwise it's a great movie called Master and Commander, which takes place on a British frigate during the Napoleonic Wars 200-odd years ago. And there's a wonderful scene where an old sailor has to rush up the mast to take down a sail in a storm. And you see for a second the letters tattooed on his fingers, HOLDFAST, hold fast. Now, that's fantastic advice if you're on the top yardarm of a British frigate trying to traverse the Tierra del Fuego or Cape of Good Hope or wherever they are. It's also excellent advice if you're a small country going through what amounts to an Islamist tidal wave or huge wave crashing on your decks. It's particularly good advice in a period when Israel's principal ally in the world, the United States, seems to be increasingly hesitant about its purposes in the Middle East, minded to retreat from its engagements and entanglements in the rest of the world, burned by the war in Afghanistan, burned by the war in Iraq, sick of having at every twist and turn to learn the names of a new set of unpalatable leaders in this or that corner of the world, and mindful, not least, that we have major economic problems here at home, and we'll have a harder and harder time shouldering the burdens of that we've shouldered for the past 50, 60 years globally. All of this is happening at the same time, and it puts Israel in what I think is, as I said, this uniquely difficult position. So what is it that Israeli policymakers should do? Well, as I said, there's this view I have, which is hold fast. We like to think, being Americans, that if there's a problem, there has to be a solution. And the best way to address the problem is to apply the solution in the quickest manner possible. That's why you get organizations titled Peace Now. It appeals to a profoundly democratic instinct. What do you want? Out of Vietnam. When do you want it? Now. I mean, this is out of Nicaragua or whatever. This is an old story when it comes to American political movements. But the fact of political life is that things don't operate that way. In politics, problems have to be managed. Diseases are chronic. You think you've solved a problem and new problems come your way. You are a sailor traveling towards an endless horizon when it comes to dealing with political problems. And that's to a large extent the situation that Israel finds itself in today. It has been going for solutions for the past 19 years and finding that every time it thinks it has solved a problem, it's actually merely substituted one set of problems for another. Israel thought it had solved a problem with the Palestinians during the 1993 Oslo Accords by recognizing the PLO, by shaking Yasser Arafat's hand, by welcoming him into Gaza, into Ramallah, and setting the stage for what was hoped to be a viable Palestinian state. What it discovered is that it shed the problem that it previously had of full-scale occupation, but got a new problem, Yasser Arafat and everything he represented. Israel thought it had shed a problem 12 years ago when it withdrew from its security corridor in Lebanon. But in fact, what it got was Hezbollah hard on its borders, and 6 years later that led to a very nasty war with Hezbollah. Israel thought it had shed a problem when it finally removed not only its settlements, but 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip. But what it in fact got was a new kind of problem, which is the Gaza Strip as a kind of terrorist entrepot, firing not scores, not hundreds, but thousands of rockets and missiles on territory that was, by any definition, purely and properly Israeli. So before Israel leaps another time and makes the case that now is the time to bring into existence a Palestinian state because it will improve the country's image in the world or it will solve a demographic crisis, looming demographic crisis, it has to think that what it really will be doing is substituting one set of problems for another, and those other new problems may well be worse. Now, does this mean that I oppose the creation of a Palestinian state? No, in fact, I support it. I am firmly and have long been firmly in favor of the idea of a two-state solution. Why? Because in the long term, it makes sense. In the long term, Israel cannot forever rule over, to some degree or another, people who don't want to be ruled by Israel. It doesn't make sense for Israel's long-term demographic future. It doesn't make sense along all kinds of lines. But there's a difference between theory and practice. There's a difference between doing something right now and waiting on events to see when there's a more auspicious occasion to do something. The problem that Israel has with the Palestinians is not, as people imagine, a territorial problem. People think, and this is why settlements have become such an issue, that the only thing that keeps peace from happening is that Israel has these settlements and the roads that go to those settlements and so on that occupy Palestinian land. Now, if that were the case, then every time you removed a settlement, you would presumably get less conflict, not more. But the experience of the Gaza Strip tells us that when Israel removed its settlements in toto from there, the Gaza Strip didn't suddenly become Singapore on the Mediterranean. It became Afghanistan on the Mediterranean. So Israel needs to think carefully about what it does next. I am happy with the idea, if you were to tell me, remove every settlement and Israel will have peace at last, I think very few people would say, okay, why not? That's a price worth paying. The problem we have now is that that's not the reality Israelis have experienced. The real problem that Israel has with the Palestinians isn't territorial, it's existential. It's that Palestinians, or too many Palestinians, under their breath or out loud, are simply not prepared to live with a Jewish state of Israel in any borders. Not along the 67 lines, not along the 47 lines, under no borders whatsoever. And until something fundamental changes in Palestinian political culture, Israel is going to continue to have a problem with its neighbors. Look, I hope you know what the 49th parallel is. The 49th parallel is what separates most of Canada, or Western Canada, from the United States. If the 67 line is another 49th parallel, none of us ought to have a problem with it. But it's not a 49th parallel, and that's the crux of the issue. So my first counsel to Israel is hold fast. Don't rush into decisions which become, in hindsight, look foolish and turn out to be irrevocable. The next thing, though, is that there are initiatives Israelis can take, sensible initiatives, to improve their position, improve their image in the world. And those are initiatives that we need to take urgently. I mean, Israel has problems other than the conflict. It is astonishing that 28% of young 18-year-old Israeli boys find a way to get out of military service. Overwhelmingly, those are yeshiva exemptions. That needs to be, that relationship between Israel and one of its most vibrant Jewish communities, between the state of Israel and one of its most vibrant communities, needs to be seriously rethought. Zionism cannot survive if so many Israelis are finding a way out of the most basic Zionist commitment. Israel needs a new deal with its own Arab citizens, and that's a fact of life. Israel has made a kind of sour deal with its Arab citizens, saying, we don't want you so much in the state, and you don't want to be so much in the state, so we're going to come to this halfway house solution in which, okay, you have 9 seats in the Knesset, and you have some places at the university. There has to be, on the one hand, a fuller embrace of Israeli Arabs with the expectation that in exchange, Israeli Arabs become committed Israelis and not ambivalent or hostile Israelis. And there has to be a means of doing that. I mean, here in the United States, we have overcome these kinds of tensions. And Israelis could probably stand to learn from what America has done to fully integrate all of its communities, including those with a relationship of hostility or differences with the majority. A third thing that Israel needs to do is it needs to rethink the way it fights the delegitimization battle. You know, not here obviously today, but often when I go speak on university campuses, it's like I go to, Brown or Columbia or Michigan, Pittsburgh, and there's some large contingent of Palestinian Solidarity Campaign students, and, we have a debate, and I kind of enjoy it. But the point is not to try to win over hostile opinion at elite universities. The point is to make friends where you're already likely to have them. Israelis, American Jews, are becoming dimly aware that there's this huge community of committed evangelical Christians and Catholics who are disposed to like Israel. And slowly, a process of engagement is taking place that is making an ally of such a huge segment of the such a huge and important segment of the American public. We can also do that abroad. Do you know that the Ministry of Education of South Korea sends officials to Israel to study the educational techniques of Israel? Now, this is totally hilarious because anyone who knows anything about Israeli education knows that it's totally execrable. It's horrible. Israel succeeds intellectually despite its educational system, not because of it. But it indicates in South Korea a kind of philo-Semitism, an admiration for Israel. I once met a young Chinese woman in Cleveland who was getting her MBA at Case Western University. And this was at a synagogue event. I said, what brings you here? And she said, in this sort of heavy accent to which I can't do justice, she said, we Chinese people know Jewish people, smartest in the world. And I said, well, no, that's ridiculous. Come on, there are smart people everywhere. And she said, no, Nobel Prize in Physics, 34% Jewish. Nobel Prize in Medicine, 37% Jewish. I forgot what it was. And, they were very impressive statistics. But what really impressed me was her insistence that this was a view that was broadly shared in China. There's a huge wellspring of philo-Semitism in India. We spend a lot of time in Jewish communities worried about anti-Semitism and delegitimization. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about how we can win over or solidify friendships which are there for the taking. Can we do that? That's something that I imagine we can do. Finally, we need, I think, to radically improve our game when it comes to making the case for Israel everywhere. And if you've heard me speak before, you've probably heard me say this, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's important. Look, I'm a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and it's a right-of-center editorial page, and it's very easy to make the conservative case for Israel. What's that? Simple. You hear Pat Buchanan say, Americans are sending their sons and daughters to war to do the bidding of the Likud, in Iraq and elsewhere. That's nonsense. American soldiers have died for the sake of Bosnians, Kosovars, Somalis, Iraqis, Saudis, Kuwaitis, Afghans. Not a single American soldier that I'm aware of has ever died in defense of Israel. Why? Because uniquely among major American allies, Israel is the one country that actually defends itself. Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet we still send troops to Germany, presumably in the defense of Europe. South Korea has become a first world country. We still deploy tens of thousands of American soldiers to the demilitarized zone. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. We still have 30,000 soldiers and sailors in Japan. All of that, by the way, costs a great deal of money, although you'll hear this anti-Semitic rant that we're sending $3 billion a year to Israel, never thinking how much it costs to keep our bases in Okinawa or Yokohama and so on. Israel is the one country that defends itself. That's the core conservative case to be made for Israel. There's obviously a core Jewish case to be made for Israel, and I'm not going to make it now, but it's obvious and goes without saying. Christians are making a case for Israel, which I think is hugely important, and it's something that the American Jewish community needs to learn to embrace much more fully. But the most important case to be made for Israel is the liberal case for Israel. And I say this because the greatest and most vicious attacks today against Israel are coming, frankly, from the left. Yes, I know there's Mel Gibson and there are Birchers and Nazis and all these fanatics on the right, but the really poisonous attacks are coming from the political left. They're coming from people who call themselves liberals and progressives. But they're not liberal and they're not progressive. So whenever, especially on college campuses, I know there's some students here in the room, I say to them, how many of you are in favor of women's rights? How many of you think that women should have the same choices and opportunities in life as men do? I suspect most of the students here will agree to that. How many of the students are in favor of gay rights? Do you think that gay people should not feel threatened, assaulted, fearful for the fact of being gay? I suspect most people would agree with that view too. How many people here believe that it's a responsibility of government to leave their country a little bit greener than they found it, to have some sense of environmental responsibility? How many people think that freedom of the press is hugely important, freedom of expression, and that's a right you would never want to part with or your society to part with? How many of you believe that there's something called the rule of law to which everyone in a country, including presidents and prime ministers and members of parliament and congressmen, should be held accountable? Is that a liberal value? Go down the whole list, and you will find that the only country in the Middle East that defends and supports and has actually enlarged those values is Israel. You don't find gay rights in Palestine. You don't find women's rights in Saudi Arabia. You don't find proper environmental stewardship in Egypt. You don't find a functioning rule of law in Syria. You don't find a free press in Iran, and so on. So if someone is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and says they have a theological problem with Israel and they're against a Jewish state, I can't argue with that. But if you're going to call yourself a liberal and progressive and at the same time turn around and say, I'm against the one state in that region that is liberal and progressive, then you're either a fool or a hypocrite. Final point, and then I'll turn to questions. It's Israeli Independence Day, 64 years of Israeli independence. And I know I've given, for the most part, a fairly bleak speech. But I think it's worth thinking that America's 64th birthday came in 1840. 1840 was a little bit after the South Carolina crisis of nullification. It was just after a huge financial crisis that, I know this will electrify all of you, destroyed the Martin Van Buren administration, but it was the great financial crisis of its day. It was a few years before the invasion of Mexico. It was about 10 years before the increasingly nasty political debates that led to Bleeding Kansas and then an American Civil War in which 620,000 soldiers died. It was ahead of the Great Depression. It was ahead of World Wars I and II and Vietnam. It was ahead of 9/11. So if you were to tell an American in 1840 that hundreds of thousands of Americans will soon die in a terrible civil war, and many more hundreds of thousands will die in various foreign wars on foreign shores, and people will go hungry in dust bowls, you'd say, you know, the future is bleak. It does not look good from the standpoint of 1840. But you might also tell another story, that the United States actually succeeded in overcoming huge challenges and emerging stronger every time it succeeded in overcoming those challenges. So it's worth maintaining that sense of historical perspective and knowing that Israel at 64 is a young country with huge challenges before it, but also huge resources, huge opportunities, and with courage and wit and ingenuity, it will match those opportunities. Thank you.
And now I'd like to open up to the floor for comments, questions, criticisms. We'll start over here.
Criticisms.
We have them.
You've covered a lot. It was interesting you started with Kissinger, given the Kissinger doctrine that empowered Iran to start with, and I call that. And I'd like to build on that a little bit. That's my first question. That is, there seems to be, throughout the region, and you can't all call it Arab, because there's Islamic aspects to it. We have the pan-Arabism of Nasser.
Mm-hmm.
But more fundamentally, I think you have Turkey perhaps trying to reestablish parts of the Ottoman Empire, the power base. You have the Iranians trying to establish the Persian Empire power base. You have the Saudis who always get someone else to fight their battles and sort of represent the oil power base. And the interactions that all of those are taking. I'd like you to discuss that. And the second thing I'd like to discuss is the power of fundamentalism, which crosses over so many lines throughout both the Arab world and increasingly in the Western world, including, and its effect with women. We've seen the negative effects, and it infests Israel, it infests the Arab states tremendously. And when you talked about Christians supporting Israel, you have that segment of conservative Christendom that doesn't seem to like gays or perhaps empower women as well.
Right. So that's a hugely broad set of questions. You have in Turkey today talk about a certain kind of neo-Ottomanism because of the popularity of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the prime minister, and his government. The Neo-Persian aspect is not entirely accurate. In fact, it's not accurate at all. But the broader issue, aside from what you would expect in any region, which is jockeying for influence and power among a diverse set of countries with languages, ethnicities, and so on, the overwhelming fact of the Muslim world today is the rise of Islamist fundamentalism. It began in 1979 with Shiite Islamism, but that in many ways inspired Sunni Islamism everywhere from Indonesia to Morocco and everywhere in the Islamic crescent in between. And this is, it's a huge fact, and it is a hugely interesting fact. Why is it that in the 21st century, arguably the most powerful single political current in the world is a movement that in many aspects is medieval in many of its attitudes, much of its outlook? A few years ago, I had the wonderful experience of interviewing the former president of Indonesia, a guy by the name of Abdul Rahman Wahid, better known among Indonesians as Gus Dur. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was a titanic figure. And before he became, unhappily, for about a year or two, president of Indonesia, he was head of a group called the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Muslim social organization in the world, has in excess of 40 million members. He was also famously a liberal and a progressive in his thinking, and he was a genuine intellectual. And I had a chance in Jakarta to spend a few hours talking to him. And his observation, which I thought was interesting, was that Islamism, as it developed after 1979, and really a little bit before 1979, was a furious reaction to the kind of soulless Western education that many Muslims who had gone to the West to be educated or were being educated in Western-like institutions in their own country. It was a reaction to what he called the sort of Comtean positivism, kind of a materialist spirit in the West, the absence of spiritual culture, higher ideals. And so the turn toward Islamism was kind of a predictable reaction to aspects of Western pedagogy and thinking that left a huge segment of the world cold and indifferent and angry. And this is something worth reflecting on. You talk to most of the current cadre of leaders in Iran at high levels, or in fact in the Muslim Brotherhood. I once interviewed the deputy head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he said he had gotten his master's degree at the University of Missouri. Senior Iranian officials all were at American institutions, Berkeley, University of Houston, other places, Columbia, MIT, before they came back to join the revolution in Iran. Those experiences in the West were formative. They were reactive. And that helps explain, I don't want to say that Islamism is a function of some Western failure, but there's an aspect about that which I think is worth thinking about and hasn't been remarked about sufficiently. There's a second factor, which is the persistence of a kind of totalitarian mindset in human history. There's a wonderful line in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. I don't know if you've read it. It's the greatest novel. No, it's the second greatest novel of the 20th century. But you really should read it. Philosophically, it's probably the greatest novel. You're all wondering what the greatest novel of the 20th century is, but I will leave you hanging. At any rate, at the heart of the Magic Mountain, there's this debate between this character named Nafta, who's a ex-Jesuit priest and a kind of proto-totalitarian, who's having these debates with this sort of happy-go-lucky, kind of progressive Italian thinker. They're both dying of tuberculosis. It's on the eve of the First World War. The metaphor is easy to follow. But they have this debate in which the progressive says, oh, the world is getting better, progress makes people happier, and so forth. And this ex-Jesuit character says, it is a fundamental mistake to believe, or it's a fundamental error of youth to believe that man's deepest desire is to be free. Man's deepest desire is to obey. That's a very interesting thought, a very provoking one, and one that's very unsettling to us good, small d Democrats in this room who think everyone, everywhere wants to be free, right? That's what human nature is about. Well, it turns out maybe not. And maybe Islamism has managed to capture something of that fundamental psychological impulse, like many, not just Islamism, but many fundamentalist religious groups, and Judaism is by no means excluded from this, of people who don't want to make choices in their life and want their choices made for them. And Islamism has managed to capture something of that as well. It is not entirely wrong to say that a lot of women living within the strictures of an Islamist society do so quite happily and voluntarily. And that's scary. It's scary to think about it. It's nice for us to say these burqas are being basically shoved onto the heads of these women. Not entirely the case. And so when we talk about the kind of change that we want in the Middle East, we often say we want democracy. But what we really want is liberalism. Democracy is just a mechanism whereby people vote for whatever they want. But what we want is to foster cultures that tilt towards freedom, that tilt towards choice, that tilt towards diversity, that tilt towards toleration, that tilt towards pluralism. Democracy itself voted in Hitler, obvious example. It voted in Hamas. So these are factors that we need, to consider very carefully and when we assess the rise of Islamism. How you go about dealing with that rise is a very difficult question, and I think it's worth, everyone should reread Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. Deeply flawed book, but nonetheless interesting. People should read Jean-Francois Revel's The Totalitarian Temptation from 1976, or The Captive Mind by Czesław, I'm massacring his Polish name, Czesław Miłosz. There is an extensive Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon. Someone here, if there's a professor, please offer a course in the literature of totalitarianism. It is a fascinating subject because what we are now dealing with at a philosophical and psychological level is similar to what we experienced back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s when you had, the best minds in American academia marching towards Stalin. It's a long answer. I don't even know if I answered your question. Far
people,
side,
yeah.
so.
Thank you. Thank you.
I need someone on my far right?
I might be closer to that. I've been really blessed to have this semester taken a class called Politics of Islam, and I've gotten really, it's going from having really no idea to now into this, and then hearing you speak about a subject, particularly about the Muslim Brotherhood and the events in Egypt. I just had to write a big paper about the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood. This has been awesome, so thank you so much for your time.
That's very nice of you. Thank you.
But my question is specifically with regard to Israel and the new Egypt. A lot of what I read, and I've read blinding amounts, has been the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood will say, the Salafists, they've got their own bent. They are certainly more fundamentalist, certainly more into Sharia law. But the Muslim Brotherhood seemed to say, but we are too, but we just do the slow play. In the beginning you had said it, you really summed it up great. Islamic politics really likes the slow play. They will dominate the world as far as they're concerned. And if it takes 1,000 years to do it, that's fine by them. They know it'll happen, it seems. And they're criticizing the Salafists, saying they want it today, and we'll take it eventually. And it seems like it was shocking to me how many people voted 30%, more or less, for the Salafists. And it's like, oh my God, I didn't realize how many people were really bent on this hardline Muslim thought and this interest in Sharia domination of Egypt. I understand why, but from a political standpoint, they want something different. And it seems that they just are a lot of them, when they interviewed the students, or the younger folks, said, we just want anything that's not Mubarak. And it seems that the Salafists are just, they run a cleaner ship. They're not so dirty.
Yeah.
And that's better. And hopefully if we have democracy and if it doesn't work out, we'll pick somebody else. And it seems strange to me that they would vote in this way for something so hardline. I understand they want something different. But it doesn't seem, as far as what I've been reading, what is this young Egyptian sentiment towards the Muslim Brotherhood or toward the Salafists, and how open are they to relations with Israel? I know both groups say, we're going to address this. We have to go sit down and talk about Israel again, because whatever deals were on the table, they say they're going to respect them. It's doubtful that they will fully. But what are the young people saying in Egypt? Are they saying, well, Israel's not that bad. They can do their thing. We just want new leadership. We want anything that's not Mubarak. Or are they really gravitating toward this hardline Islamist thought?
Look, I think as I was trying to mention in my answer to this gentleman, it's the kind of typical thinking in the West that people move away from old thinking, old conceptions, old religion and towards their own idea, their own pursuit of happiness. But the reality, and this is, I'm sure, true of many people, is sometimes they move in the opposite direction. Sometimes they grow up in secular households and then they become, as a number of cousins of mine, very Orthodox Jews. The gravity moves in a different way. And you had under Mubarak a secular dictatorship, which makes the Muslim Brothers and the Salafists an attractive alternative because they're an alternative, because they're religious, because they are perceived to be appealing to something higher than, not something more than material prosperity, because there is a perception of, if not incorruptibility, less corruption. All of that comes into play. Also, because they're organized. Because when the Egyptian government was putting up horrible hospitals throughout the country, the Muslim Brothers were running effective clinics. Hezbollah, by the way, did the same thing in Lebanon. They created social networks. What I'm trying to say is there's no real one answer to, there's no real one way of addressing why is it that you have this huge cohort of Egyptians, young and old, who seem to be spellbound by the appeal of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a combination of factors. It's everything from being something else to being religious, to being fundamentalist religious, to being kind of totalitarian in their outlook. I should make one point, which is there are fundamental differences between the Salafists and the Brothers. And it's not simply that the Salafists are more extreme, although they are. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood hasn't been associated with at least Al-Qaeda-style terrorism for a very, very long time, if really ever at all. But the Salafists obviously, have for quite some time. But the basic difference between the Brothers and the Salafists is the Salafist ideology is radical. The Brotherhood ideology is conservative. The Brothers want to kind of slowly suffocate society into a kind of conformist, conservative Muslim orthodoxy, not ultra-conservative, but conservative. Hijab, not niqab. The Salafists are going after something much more fundamental, not a return to some imagined previous way, but a kind of radical destruction of everything as society as they know it. Muslim Brotherhood is capable of living side by side with at least democratic procedure and democratic institutions. Salafists are completely incapable of doing that. Those differences are not incapable, but against doing anything of the kind. Those differences are worth bearing in mind. Finally, with respect to your question about Israel, look, there is wall-to-wall hatred in Egypt for Israel. And some of the most ferocious hatred comes actually from people who otherwise describe themselves as liberal. Some of the most naked anti-Semitism has come out of a woman who's the vice president of the Liberal Party of Egypt. I mean, never mind, we don't like Israel. We don't like Jews. Benjamin Franklin warned against the Jew. And, there's all these ridiculous anti-Semitic conspiracies that float around on the internet and are treated as gospel by people who are, the liberals, the good guys in Egyptian society. Egypt and much of the Arab world, much of the Muslim world is saturated by anti-Semitism. And don't stop me with the objection that they're Semitic people too. Call it Jew hatred. They do not like Jews. I mean, one of the wonderful examples, these things proliferate, but once I was asked at the Wall Street Journal to meet with a group of journalists from the Arab world. And I told them what the Wall Street Journal's about, or some of our points of view, et cetera, et cetera. And a woman, now these are the people who are selected by the State Department as promising Arab journalists to come on a junket to the United States. She says, given the fact that Mr. Robert Murdoch is Jewish, how does this affect your view of the Zionist question? And I said, first of all, it's Rupert Murdoch, and Mr. Murdoch is Catholic. He's not in fact Jewish. She said, no, it is well known. Mr. Rupert Murdoch is Jewish. I said, no, I'm Jewish. Rupert Murdoch is a Christian. And she said, but I have read Mr. Rupert Murdoch is a very rich man. And this is, I was just kind of, this stops you, and I said, well, I know of certain Saudi princes who are probably even richer than Mr. Murdoch, and I don't think that they're Jewish by any description. But this is the sort of thing that just kind of came out, like, it's not even sort of whispered, oh, we don't like the Jews, this kind of naked anti-Semitism. And I don't think people appreciate what a powerful force this is, not only in the cultural life of the Arab and Muslim world, but in the political life. These are societies that have organized themselves solely around the concept of hating Jews. And it's worth remembering that anti-Semitism actually is a political movement. If you study the history of, it's not a prejudice. It is the political movement expressing that prejudice. Wilhelm Marr and the founders of modern-day anti-Semitism in late 19th century Europe wanted to start a political movement against Jewry. And what they called themselves are anti-Semites, in the way that other people call themselves liberals or progressives or neoconservatives or whatever you want to do that. That's worth thinking about too. The political uses to which anti-Semitic dogma and prejudice has been put in the Muslim world to organize their societies and sustain their dictatorships. I'm sure you've read 1984, if you remember the 2 minutes of hate against Emmanuel Goldstein. Not surprising he's named Goldstein.
There's two more questions, and of course Hamas's charter mentions Jews
Yeah.
to kill. Yeah, who do you want to call? You can go.
I agree with everything you said, except that your idea that Israel's best policy is to hold fast, that gets me nervous, because there's part of me that says that people are going to hate you anyway, so you might as well show I'm the biggest, not in terms of size, but that I'm a strong bully, and if you dare try to fight me again, remember what I do to you this time. And the best way for a small nation to do that is by surprise. Remember the Six-Day War versus the Yom Kippur War, where they didn't want to seem like the aggressors, and they waited to get attacked first. You know what I'm saying? I just remember going in Golan Heights, this man who was taking us around Golan Heights said, you see that? That's the Syrian border. But they don't like us, but they won't dare attack us because they remember what we did to them in 1967. And our missiles can reach Damascus. It's only 25 miles from here. And they remember what we did to them, and they'll never try it again. Sometimes you can't be so humanitarian and for détente and thought. Sometimes you have to just, a bit scared.
Well, I think we actually don't disagree. All I'm saying is that when I said hold fast, is that contrary to the view of people who make the argument that now is the time for Israel to make, quote, bold moves for, quote, peace, that Israel should move with, instead with a tremendous amount of caution when it comes to reaching agreements or conceding territory, and then later regretting those agreements or those concessions. So I don't disagree. I don't think we disagree. The other point that you're making is that strength is respected in the Middle East. And I think that point is one we're constantly forgetting and having to learn again. I think Israel pays a price for making concessions which it hopes will be seen as signs of magnanimity and big-heartedness, but are taken as by Israel's enemies as proof that the Israelis are in retreat and that they can be pushed further, and if they're pushed far enough, they'll make concessions. I mean, to use the most recent obvious example, I mean, I feel very keenly for the family of, or I felt very keenly for the family of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier who was taken hostage for 6 years. But I think Israel has set itself up for a world of hurt and pain because sooner or later there will be another young Israeli who will find himself in a similar situation, and because Israel has set the example that it is willing to exchange 1,000 people for the sake of one person, that we are jeopardizing, that Israel is jeopardizing other of its citizens. So those are, the basic point that I think needs to be made is that politics cannot be an exercise in self-congratulation. Israel has been for a number of years trying to say, look, we took risks for peace. We made these concessions. We withdrew from these territories. Don't you love us? And the world says, no, we don't love you. Because you still have to make this, that, and the other concession. And on the day that Israel withdraws from every inch of the West Bank, should it ever do so, there will be another demand. Look at what happened when Israel withdrew from Lebanon. It withdrew, according to the UN, withdrew to the, absolutely to the border. And Hezbollah said, no, there's this place, the Sheba Farms, that's ours. And Sheba Farms became the alibi for further attacks. There will be another alibi. It will be refugees, or it will be some provocation. Something will happen. So Israel, and I think every country, has to recognize that, especially every Western democratic country, has to recognize that its attempts to be great and magnanimous against dictatorships or against fanatics are simply seen as openings for further demand, as proof of eventual weakness and a will to capitulate. And so those are thoughts that I think that people need to keep in mind.
We could stay here all night, but Bret has to get back to New York, so we'll take one more question.
We really have to ask a few more questions. I hope that we stop making speeches and ask questions. My question is twofold. You've indicated what it has existed for many years, this feeling that the Arab world hates Jews. But at the same time, we've made friends in other parts of the world. Is it possible, because of the internet and in time, and because younger people have a way of evolving through the internet, actually, and computers, that we could make friends in the Arab world and make it possible for us to live with them in peace, because Israel has a lot to offer in terms of its technology and its industry. The other part of my question, which I'm surprised you didn't address, is the vexing question of what is going to happen what is Israel going to do about the fact that the Iranians are going to get a bomb? Are they going to bomb, which, from my point of view, is not a good idea, but that's besides the point. I would like your point of view on that.
The reason I didn't address it is because I figured that it was inevitable that someone would ask about Israel and Iran, and so let me just address your 2 points. Look, we should never forget that political culture does change. No country in the world was more saturated by fanatical and genocidal anti-Semitism than Germany was just 70 years ago. My wife today is German. It is a changed country. People change. And we should also give some people, when we can, the benefit of the doubt. Earlier, when I was having dinner with Professor Shapiro and a couple of other people talking about Syria. And one of the themes in my speech is curb your enthusiasm. What might come after the Assad regime could be equally bad. But we owe those brave, brave Syrians who are coming out in the street day after day a great deal of respect. They are risking their lives against an awful and despicable tyranny. And in that, there might be the seeds of a new country, a new attitude, a new outlook. They understand, perhaps, in Syria, that everything they've been told by their regime is a lie, and one of the things is Israel is this horrible, despicable country. In fact, when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, one of the delightful facets was to get email from people, not always in the Arab world, but often in the Muslim world, saying, I look to the Jerusalem Post for a different perspective, and you're providing one. And I have X, Y, and Z questions or criticisms, and I would always answer those people. Another little story, I know I'm taking too much time, but another little story in this connection. So a few years ago, I went out to Egypt to do some interviews with the Muslim Brotherhood. And before I'd gone to Egypt, I had called a colleague of mine, and I said, I need a fixer. I need a young man who can translate for me and set up meetings with the Brotherhood. And at the same time, I was going to a meeting of the World Economic Forum in Sharm el-Sheikh, the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula. And I was going in the company of a wonderful friend of mine by the name of Irshad Manji, who's a Canadian woman who wrote a book several years ago called The Trouble with Islam. She's a Muslim originally from Uganda, and considers herself and is a Muslim reformer. So anyway, we were both going to this conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. I had mentioned, I'm going to go to Cairo to interview the Muslim Brothers. She said, I'd love to go with you, but there's this fatwa against me, so it's a little bit tricky. And I said, well, come along anyway. One of the stupider things I ever did. And so we fly from Sharm el-Sheikh to Cairo, and at the appointed hour, we meet this young Amr Barghezi character, 23-year-old Egyptian Muslim, had never left Egypt at that point in his life, was going to a kind of second-rate Egyptian university, spoke excellent English, came well recommended. And I said to him, Amr, I hope you don't mind, but a colleague of mine from the World Economic Forum named Irshad Manji will be joining us for a few days. He looked at her, he said, Irshad Manji, I know who you are. And there was a pause, and I thought, oh no, this is already a disaster. Then he said, I read your book. And then he said, I loved your book. And then he turned to me and he said, look, perhaps we can just be honest with each other from the outset. I used to read you all the time in the Jerusalem Post. I said, no kidding. He said, yeah, for the most part, I agreed with what you had to say with one exception. I said, what was that? He said, your review of the film Munich. I mean, it was just such a waste of time to dignify that stupid movie with a political critique. It's this young Egyptian man who knew more about Heidegger and Kant and Hegel and Western philosophy than I did as a student of political philosophy at the University of Chicago. Loved to play heavy metal on his electric guitar, and whose mind was just extraordinary. And I thought, this is a guy who's going places. We wound up finding a way to send him to the University of Chicago for a master's degree, and he now runs a group called the Egyptian Union for Liberal Youth in Cairo. And guys like him are there, and they're real, and they're doing really important work, and we have to figure out how to cultivate them, how to help them, how to let them become principal players in Egyptian society, not to solve problems in the next year or in 5 years, but maybe in 20 years. You never know. Now, to your great $64 gazillion question, if Ben Bernanke keeps easing, we're going to have to up the $64,000 question a great deal. Look, there are two questions here. Should the United States attack Iran in the event that diplomacy fails, as I expect it will fail? Should Israel attack Iran? I have been on the record saying it is not right for a great power like the United States to delegate to a small power like Israel an issue that it is as vital to the national security of the entire world as the nuclearization of Iran. We shouldn't hope or fear, whatever, that Israel will somehow pull our whatchamacallit out of the fire. So that's my principal view. that someone has to make sure that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, because as even President Obama has come around to recognizing, a nuclear Iran cannot be contained. A nuclear Iran will lead to a nuclear spiral, a spiral of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, and a nuclear Iran that is already the world's leading sponsor of terrorism cannot be trusted with a bomb like that. You know, I say to people, and I don't understand why people who call themselves liberals say, don't go to war with Iran. This is a country, if a country can hold a stone in its left hand and stone a woman to death, are you going to give it a nuclear bomb in its right hand to bomb other countries into the Stone Age? I think that's incredible for people who consider themselves liberals to say, yeah, good idea. Let's give the most illiberal, fanatical, woman-hating, gay-hating regime in the world the most terrible weapons. So that's a position that the United States should take. Now, Israel is in a uniquely difficult position because an attack on Iran's nuclear installations is not impossible, but it is, in my view, at the outer periphery of its capability. And no one should imagine that an Israeli attack on Iran will look like Iraq. You're in, you're out, it's gone, you've bought yourself 3, 5, 10 years. The Iranians will probably respond, and Israel will have a war on its hand that resembles something like the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was not a nice war. However, if Iran should slide into becoming a nuclear weapons state, the future of Israel in the region becomes considerably bleaker. Its options diminish. People say the Iranians will never lob a bomb at Israel. It would be suicidal for them. We all know Israel has a nuclear arsenal. But it's not the point of them detonating a bomb or lobbing it at Tel Aviv. With nuclear weapons, possession is use. Once you possess a bomb, you are able to do things, you're able to operate in a way that non-nuclear states simply can't. Why? Because you know that you've got that 45 in your back pocket. Possession is use. And don't forget that a country like Iran, that is, in a sense, a world revolutionary power, might actually be tempted to try to destroy Israel. Imagine if Iran finds itself in a couple of years in a position similar to Bashar Assad today. It feels it's going down the tubes. There's a long simmering revolt against the Iranian regime, similar to what's happening in Damascus and elsewhere in Syria today. Do you think the regime is going to go quietly into the night if it has a nuclear weapon? What do you think the last act of such a regime with a nuclear weapon would be? So those are reasons why Israel has to think very carefully before it convinces itself that doing everything it can to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons just isn't worth it, that the immediate price to be paid is high. There will be unforeseeable consequences to any kind of attack on Iran. That's true of every military attack in history. There are perfectly foreseeable consequences to what happens if the Iranians become a nuclear weapon state, and those consequences ought to, in this room, to terrify us. So think very carefully. Life is not a question of choosing the easy path against the hard path. You look down two roads, they both look bad. A nuclear Iran is a much worse road for Israel to take, for the United States to take. So we should have use some mature judgment.
There should be some pastries and other things out there. Bret can stay just a couple more minutes before he has to go, but I want to thank you very much for coming out here. Thank you. And thank you all for coming out on such a dreary night. Good night, everyone.